It's Friday. It's noon Eastern time. It must be time for Live with Kevin. It must be time for another episode in our Future of Work series. You're going to love our conversation today. Welcome. I'm glad that you're here. This is a live session, which means what? Which means that you have more control than you realize, which means if we want to hear your comments, your questions, and we'll use those to frame this conversation. What we're going to talk about today is the next rules of work. And I'm going to introduce my guest. You can see his smiling face here. I'm going to introduce him in a second, but let me just frame it up this way. We know that the future of work is going to be different. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, perhaps. Maybe that's why you're here. But we also know that if the world of work is going to be different, that means the skills will need to be different, perhaps. And the rules of what will be success at work will be different. And that's why we're here to talk about the new rules of work. And let me introduce you to Gary. Gary Bolles is, he's a writer and lecturer around the world on the future of work, learning, and the organization. He's the author of an upcoming book. Hold it up, Gary. The next rules of work, the mindset, skill set, and tool set to lead your organization through uncertainty. And has 9 courses on LinkedIn Learning, one of the many things he and I have in common, with over 850,000 learners. As the chair for the future of work at Singularity University, Gary helps people understand the impact of exponential change on the worlds of work and education. As a partner in the consulting agency Charette, he helps organizations, communities, educators, and governments develop strategies to meet the needs of tomorrow's workers and learners. And as the co-founder of eParachute.com, he helps job hunters, job changers with programs inspired by the What Color Is Your Parachute book, the world's enduring manual on careers. And so you seem uniquely qualified, Gary, for us to have this conversation. And what, when I reached out to you a few weeks ago, when we found you, if you will, and I reached out to you, I was struck by how much we have in common, at least in terms of some of the work that we do and the direction in which we're heading. And so I'm super excited that you're here. And we've got people so far. We've got people from Brazil with us. So if you're here, there you go. And others are doing the same. Tell us where you're from, and we'll give you a little call out here on the screen. So over we have San Francisco, which is also where Gary is, as well as Brazil. I know lots more. So just let us know where you're at. Ask your questions along the way. So Gary, let's just dive in. You are the chair for the future of work at a university. So let's just start there. What are you seeing as you look at the future of work? Just sort of that big picture question. Like what are you seeing as you look at it today?
No, absolutely. So first off, Kevin, thank you for the invitation. We do have a lot of similar passions, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I actually was part of a closing keynote for a conference, virtual conference in Brazil yesterday. So it's wonderful to see some of the people who might have been attending there as well. So first off, the Singularity University is neither about the singularity nor is it a university. So we have some identity issues that we're working on, but it's not about the singularity necessarily, because Ray Kurzweil, the co-founder, who wrote books like The Singularity is Near, The Singularity is Nearer, and maybe the next one will be The Singularity is Nearest. I don't know. It's the nanosecond away. I've known Ray since the dawn of time. And his vision was that there would be this sort of crossover point where, a computer would be, as smart as a human. And some argue we've already passed that point if you add up all the computing power in the world, and some argue we'll never reach that point because, how can one of these things be as smart as us? But Singularity University is actually sort of a think tank, like a virtual think tank. It's hundreds of brainiacs smart on everything from artificial intelligence to next generation medicine, and a global community of change makers in a variety of different organizations and a lot of startups. And so I get the amazing opportunity to be able to, as adjunct chair for the future of work, to leverage all these amazing insights from all these people around the world and synthesize them together. So I'm a pattern recognizer. That's kind of what I've always enjoyed doing, just taking in inputs from a whole bunch of different places and then sort of distilling and saying, here's kind of the way I think, the patterns that I see. So when it comes to the future of work, there's always been a shifting set of patterns. And the breakdown that I do in the book is I say, well, there's always old rules of work. If you remember, people used to work on farms. Chances are most of your listeners right now aren't working on a farm. So
hey, but I grew up on one, and I'm happy
well,
to spend time on one. Just
okay. So
you're right. Chances are,
you know the drill, right? That's what you used to do.
Know the drill.
Yeah. In the early 1800s, about half to 2/3 of all the economic activity in the United States came from agriculture, and now employment it's obviously very seasonal, but employment on farms is about maybe 1.5% in the United States. And this happens, and in Brazil, it's actually still about 30 to 35% of the GDP, but it's become this much more industrial kind of management process. And so what's ended up happening is you get new rules. So you go from industrial to post-industrial and so people always talk about the new rules of work, but the truth is, because work is always changing, what I think is critical is for us to look at the next rules. And that's why I use that title. So a couple of quick insights. So first off, the future of work is never about the future. It's always about today. And it's always about what the combination of what we're afraid of and what we hope for. And so the rhetoric.
Hold on.
Sure.
Don't say that again. Sometimes people say something, here's what I know about the present. You just said the future is always about the present. What I know about the present is most people who are with us right now are probably doing something else at the same time. And so they need to hear what you just said.
Okay. All right. I'll do it a little slower. So when we talk about it's the future of work, but pretty much any future scenarios, and I always think in terms of scenarios because none of us has a real crystal ball. We might have one of those magic 8 balls that you can shake and, it says reply hazy, ask again later. But typically none of us really knows enough about how it's going to map out. So we think in terms of scenarios. What people talk about when they talk about scenarios related to the future of work is it's normally either something you're afraid of that's going to happen, you think is going to happen, or something you hope for that's going to happen. And what that does is it drives a belief system because we're all pattern recognizers. We hear 1 or 2 data points and then we think it's a trend. Journalists are always looking for 3 data points. Most articles you read, if it only has 2 data points, that's a journalist that's stretching. But if it has 3 data points, that's the way humans think, is then it's a trend. And so if you asked somebody, what's the future of work in January 2020, they would have said it's robots and software eating jobs. And I've got a lot of thoughts about that. But along came a virus, and then the future of work became, how are we all going to work remote? How are we going to continue to connect what we do as humans? Oh, we need this digital infrastructure. So what I've argued for a long time is that the real drivers are the pace and the scale of change. It's how fast things move and how many people get affected by those changes. And so the concern about robots and software was that robots and software were going to take a lot of jobs. And along came a virus, and the US experienced, on the order of 17 to 25% unemployment, depending upon the region, almost overnight. Now, other cultures and economies basically shrugged off the response to the virus, and we can talk about why at the economic level that happens. But basically, people, when they think about the future of work, they're thinking about, what am I worried about? Like, how could I lose my job or lots of jobs? Or what am I hopeful about? What kinds of work could we do? And how can we be more hopeful about that? And that's something we find with Singularity University is really, really important, is to build hopeful narratives about the future, because that's the kind of future we all want to create.
And if we're going to be, the work that we're doing, the effort that we're all putting in every day is in fact creating that future. And so I was having a conversation with someone a few minutes ago, and we were talking in a similar vein, Gary. We were talking about burdens and blessings, right? And whichever one we pick to focus on is the one we're going to start to create. So I'm right with you in terms of let's focus on the future that we hope for. So you've written this new book, which isn't actually out yet. Isn't that correct? It's like
August 31st. Yeah, ebooks now, but print is August 31st.
August the 31st. So you have copies. I don't have one. I have to solve that problem. But anyway, so
you can waive an ebook, I guess. So.
Yeah, I know, but I kind of like, you know.
Yeah, I'm an analog guy too. So yeah.
Anyway, so the question I would ask is, so what are I don't want to unpack the entire book, but if you were to say, okay, the rules are changing. We know the rules of work are changing because work is changing. So let's just start with this. How are they changing? Yeah.
So there's a variety of different lenses that we can have on work. And when I talk about work, it's really what we have labels that many people fall into using. And it becomes really challenging because there's sort of this old rules mindset about a lot of these labels. And then there's kind of a next rules, this developing set of approaches that we have. They're strategies, essentially, right? And so what I break down in the book is we have to think about work differently, jobs, careers, teams, managers, leaders in organizations, and then ultimately there's a whole bunch of things we have to think of differently at the economic level. So, but
sort
specifically,
societally or whatever.
Yeah. The way we design our peculiar forms of capitalism and the economies that result, the work economies that result. But basically, work is shifting to become more problem-centric and project-centric. If you think of it at its most simple, work is just a problem to be solved. This is something my father figured out in What Color's Your Parachute years ago. If you present yourself as a problem solver, as a job hunter, you're more likely to get the job.
Right.
So it's a problem to be solved. How do we solve problems? We perform tasks. How do we perform tasks? We have human skills. That's kind of it. Human skills apply to tasks to solve problems. And now, those of you who work in organizations, you know there's always one or two people who think it's their job to create problems, and you know exactly who they are. But for the most part, we're problem solvers. You know, when we're born, what do you do? You're a trial and error machine. You know, we don't call it trial and success. We call it trial and error. You touch the stove, it's hot, don't touch it. Well, okay, I was a pretty stupid kid. I touched the stove a couple times, but I eventually figured it out. So, but basically we're trial and error machines, right? And so what ends up happening is we solve problems. And then we find out there's certain kinds of problems we're optimized to solve. We're good at solving those problems. We enjoy solving those problems. And so we need to shift to much more of this problem-centric view of work. And it turns out we're best at solving problems when they're in projects, depending upon the kinds of problems they solve. So first off, we got to shift to a problem-centric and project-centric context for work. Second is jobs have changed significantly. And I break them down in the book to this, you know, what people often call the 6 W's. What we do for work, when, where, with whom we work, why, and how, and show how each one of those has changed. Like in the COVID era, when we hit, you know, what I call the Great Reset, the Great Reset button, we think we focus specifically on where, because so many people had to work remotely, but virtually all the other characteristics of a job changed too. And then finally, careers. Careers are shifting from this sort of 3 boxes model, as my father called it: education, then work, then leisure, in what I call the period formerly known as retirement. And that's shifting to what I call a portfolio of work. That is a constantly shifting landscape that young people are leading the way on, where learning and work and leisure activities are all in this canvas of shifting elements. That's basically a hedge against an exponential future of change.
So I want to go to change, because there was a question asked earlier, and I'm not going to leave it up there, but the question was asked, what will be the changes in industry? We got that from Brazil. But then Amy asked, and I think you started to talk about that, but Amy asked another really interesting question. And I'm not smart enough to frame it the way she did, so I'm going to ask it with her words. If the future of work is about change, scale and pace, what references do you have about change consumption? In other words, how much change can we handle?
Yeah.
This is a really interesting point, because I've often said that sometimes people will say to a leader, well, we can't handle any more change right now. Sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's just a safe excuse. But what would you say about that? What are your thoughts about Amy's question?
So first off, it's an excellent question, Amy. And I want to give a couple frames of reference that I use that I try to help. I always want to give people a little bit of a view of like the landscape, and then hopefully pointers to tools that could be helpful for us as individuals and if we lead teams, for our teams. So first off, just generally, human propensity for change is, I think of it as a kind of a Venn diagram. Yeah, I tend to overuse. I use a lot of Venn diagrams, and I use a lot of magic quadrants, right? So if you think of you as a human, and I'm assuming all of our listeners are humans. There are no highly functional AIs that are listening right now.
I think we're safe on that.
Yeah. So if you think of yourself as a human and the ways you make decisions and the way you both react to the world around you and the way that you proactively try to show up in the world, there's a set of different heuristics, like things that sort of help to define your behavior. And so one set of elements to be thinking about is how you as a human, the way that you are prepared to be solving problems. Like what's the mindset that you bring when you go to solve problems? Now, there's a marvelous book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, which I highly recommend. And what Carol does is she does a great job of helping to deconstruct the ways that we as humans build our belief systems and essentially, in my framing, our problem-solving systems over time. And what she says is, depending upon where you were born, the family you were born into, the culture of the place you were born, a whole bunch of different characters, your experiences as you grew in first in learning and then in work, you build a mindset, a generalized mindset that she puts sort of in a spectrum from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And a fixed mindset kind of aligns pretty much exactly with what I talk about with the old rules of work. You liked what you did yesterday, you like doing the same thing today, and you pretty much would like doing the same thing tomorrow. That's a fixed mindset. If you think about when you first did work, think, for anybody that's listening, think of the first jobs that you had. Well, what did you need to do the most? You just need to get paid. So that was it. Like the fixed mind says, I need to get paid. And then after a while, you sort of figure out, if I'm pretty good at it, then I get paid better. All right, so I've got to get paid, but then I've got to get good at it. And so that was the
beer and gas money, but now I want more than beer and gas money. Right?
Right. So what ended up happening with a fixed mindset, with those old rules of work, is you could just show up, do your job, make money, put a roof over your family's head and feed them, and the world was fine. And that's great. That's awesome. But in a world of rapid change, and I think with the Great Reset, we've seen just how rapidly we not only have to, but can change. Then now if you have more of a growth mindset, which is that you are a constantly changing human being, you can continually learn new things. You can continually adapt as you are confronted with new problems. You are simply going to be more ready to deal with these changes in the world. Now, to Amy's question, people with a more fixed mindset found it very, very challenging to adapt in the COVID era. And now, for many people, they would often have chosen jobs that would allow them to have much more steady state sort of activities. But then along came a virus and suddenly they were forced to change. Whereas people with more of a growth mindset are able to say, okay, this is a learning opportunity. And sure, there's a ton of stress that's associated with this, but this is a way I can actually figure out new opportunities to solve new problems. Now, that's a gross oversimplification. And of course, the challenge is that there's so much change going on in so many different arenas. What is happening in many cases is it isn't just change that people are reacting to. It's the information onslaught that comes with that change. So what you find is that if what you can do is filter out a lot of the extraneous noise and simply focus on what you need to do to be able to continually adapt, you are in alignment with those with whom you work so that you are supporting each other and all figuring out, co-creating what the new ways to work are. And you can be authentically connected to them as humans, not just this transactional focus on the tasks that you're doing, but much more deeply connected to them as humans and what you all are trying to do together. People are, the research is very, very clear. Have all those characteristics, people can adapt to change much more rapidly. But if you are isolated, if you are not well aligned with your coworkers, if you don't have the support for all the things that are going on in your life that you need, then all the research shows you will have a harder and harder time adapting.
I think that's really, I think it's right on. So you said earlier that the new rules of work fall into the areas of how we frame some of these ideas, like work and the job and our careers and teams. And then lastly, you said managers and leaders. And so, many people who are here are leaders, or they're in organizations where they're thinking about the development of their leaders. And so I think it's fair to ask this question. So what is your advice today? August the 20th, 2021, right? About what should we as leaders be thinking about in terms of our own skill development? What are the rules we need to be thinking about as leaders today?
So first off, I want to make sure I'm not being the word police. I want to tell people the labels you should or should not use. But I actually don't use the word leader. I try to avoid it as much as possible. And I think it's because if you go back decades ago to the beginning of what I think of as the leadership industrial complex, the unlimited number of books and news articles and courses and all teaching leadership. It actually goes back to In Search of Excellence.
1983.
I actually knew Bob Waterman quite well, just an amazing guy. And he and Tom Peters came up with this sort of watershed book about what you need to do to be able to be a leader in continually building great organizations. And of course, as all things happen, pretty much none of the companies that they said were excellent at the time are still excellent. And it's just the way that the world works, right? But it kicked off these set of ripple effects where people in organizations continually want to understand, how can I be the best leader possible? So the reason I don't use the word leader is because I think it's lost a lot of meaning. And instead I focus on it as a verb, leading, and those who lead in organizations, because there's a couple of mindset shifts. The first one is that leadership in organizations as a noun often refers to the black box of the top executives in the firm. And the leadership goes off into a retreat every now and then and brings the tablets down from the mount of the next strategy the organization is going to use. And it is a black box because ideas go in and never come out. And so instead, if you think of leading in an organization as an activity, a verb that anybody can do, you could actually encourage people throughout the organization to be able to lead. And so one of the great examples I use in the book is Novartis, which has an approach called unbossing. They'll literally walk into a meeting, and rather than looking for the top title to be the person who is guiding the conversation, they will say, how can we unboss this conversation? Which is basically code for who is the smartest about this topic that needs to lead us along this journey. So the first thing for leaders in the organization to be thinking about is, how can you shift the model? The old model, believe it or not, I like to use the wording from, there's an amazing book called Moonshots in Education by my great friend Esther Wojcicki, also known as Woj. And she says that the role of the teacher needs to shift from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. So what I say for leaders in organizations, hopefully just those who lead in organizations, and managers, I say, let's shift that to the mindset of the team guide. How can you be the guide? How can you be the person with the best questions to ask and not the one who has to have all the answers. And if you think of yourself as a team guide, then what you are doing is you are trying to enable the human potential of all the people in a team to be able to continually so they can self-optimize and align around dynamically binding around the next problem to solve, solving it, and moving on to the next without you ever having to tell somebody what to do.
We had a question from Brazil, and it's a more specific question, but Gary, I said, ask us questions and we'll answer them. So I'm going to have you take a shot at this.
Yeah.
And I'll read it to you if I can get it to pull up here. The question is, give me an example of what kinds of changes are happening in the food industry. Okay. So do you have any specific insights there? Because, I think both of us and lots of people get in, well, there's change everywhere. There's all sorts of change. Do you have any specifics that you might be able to help him with in this area, which really actually translates then to the rest of us, because we have to take that big concept and make it a little more concrete.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, as I mentioned, the Brazilian economy specifically, 35 to 40% of GDP is in agriculture. And so, and it's, it's the world's breadbasket. I mean, they do a lot of exports, but also there's a lot of innovation, tremendous amount of innovation in the food industry. So some of the macro changes that are important to be thinking about is, first off, one of the things that the Great Reset of the pandemic era showed us is that production and supply chains have to be resilient. And so what you've seen is a significant amount of rethinking around the world about the dynamics of how can we be as nimble as possible. I mean, when you're growing a lot of grain or a lot of soy, or you've got to be able to get that out of one place. It's got to grow, and then it's got to get to another place. But what you realize is, if the supply chains are fragile, if there's breaks in the supply chain, then you can't get it from point A to point Z. And so you have to have a completely different mindset about how you're trying to meet the needs of a market and to be as nimble as possible in anticipation of the next Great Reset. And you also have to be worried about the shifting landscape of global climate change and what that will or will not allow you to do with any particular crop or food source. So what you're seeing is a complete mindset shift, as well as a skill set and a tool set shift, to allow people to be able to have much more nimble processes about how they source food, how they produce food, how they source food, how they distribute food. And what you'll see going forward is that the most nimble organizations will be ones that have continually gone through the mindset shift, that they are trying to meet this landscape of demand with a landscape of supply that is as nimble as possible. So that's one rapid change. Another is rapid change on the demand side from the consumer standpoint. And so there's a bunch of trends that ripple through in terms of continually wanting new food innovation, new things to eat, the
ways to prepare them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, more and more farm to table opportunities, so that more and more growing is rewarded for being local, and so you don't have to worry as much about that supply chain. More and more of an opportunity to be able to change how retail happens. That is the experience in which people eat and dine out. Obviously, lots of change on the retail end, because we're still in what I call the second phase of the Great Reset, where the lights are turning on. Oh, the virus infection rate went down. Oh, no, it just popped that back up again. And so you'll see these ripple effects in how the actual delivery mechanisms, like the final point. And so then you've got to have the opportunity to be able to support all that. If you've got a food deliverer, which we often call a restaurant, that suddenly can't deliver food directly to its customers anymore by having them come, and then has to be able to distribute in other ways. And you've got to be able to provide them with the flexible supply so they can do that. So the food industry you might have thought that was a sleepy place a couple of years ago. It's one of the most dynamic arenas right now. And it requires all the same legs of the stool I keep talking about. It's a mindset shift, a new skill set, and definitely a new technological and technique tool set.
So I found at least one more thing where you and I have alignment, and that is that leadership is a verb, not a noun, or need to think about it as something that we do, not a position that we hold. And so we talked about that. And so you talked about changing the mindset and changing the rules around that. But for us as individuals, whether we're a leader taking off that hat and we're still a contributor and a team member, or whether we don't have that title, what are one or two things? And so this is almost more of a professional / career question.
Yeah.
What should we be thinking about as we prepare ourselves for a new future of work?
Yeah.
As you see it.
Absolutely. So first off, what I try to help people, there's so many issues related to the future of work and the future of learning, future of the organization. And what I say is it might be helpful to think of them in terms of domains. Like, what do you care the most about? And they tend to fall into 4 domains: individuals, organizations, communities, and countries. So what does any individual want? There's tons of things we want from jobs and work and careers and that sort of thing. But if you really distill it down, the average person wants meaningful, well-paid, reliable work today and tomorrow. And if there's lots of other things we want in our lives, but if every single person on the planet could have meaningful, well-paid, reliable work, we'd all be a lot better off, right? And there are problem statements or need statements for organizations, communities, and countries. But let's just focus on individuals. So my father was a recovering minister who was laid off from Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco in a budget crunch. And he found other ministers were being laid off. So he went to go write a little pamphlet for them that turned into the book, What Color Is Your Parachute? And he became the world's career counselor. 10 million copies in print, 17 languages. He passed away 4 years ago, but he and I started a company together. And so we've been carrying on his work in our company, eParachute. And my father found a couple of just true things about humans. The first is that and he broke them down as sort of 3 different areas. He said, when it comes to careers, he said, first off, we don't know really what it is that is true about our own skills and what drives us in terms of the work we most want to do. And so he was a big fan of telling people, the first thing to do as you're thinking about the constantly changing landscape of work is to step back and figure out the what of your own skills, interests, knowledge, the things that you love the most that can be the drivers for you in your work. I often show a picture of an iceberg when I lecture, and I say, as humans, we know this tiny little tip of the iceberg about our own skills, and then there's all this human potential we're blind to. And unfortunately, in many organizations, it's the same thing. You're blind to all the capacity, all the human potential of the people inside the organization. You know this tiny little piece that you hired them for. But as individuals, the first step is the what. And my father used this great analogy of a cart, a horse, and a road. And he said, when you're thinking about a career, your own career or a career change, think of the cart as your what. Like that's your skills, attributes, your knowledges, your history. And you need to inventory all that. If you're going to go on a trip, anything you're going to do, even if you're going to stay in the same job, you should regularly inventory, not assess, but inventory what makes you unique and what drives you. I often show a picture of a North Star or, south of the border, south of the equator, Southern Cross. That directional navigation that you would use in your career. So that's the first one. The second is where. And in the cart, horse, road, that's if you just have a cart, it's just sitting there, it's not going to go anywhere. You need to hook it up to a horse. And that is the scenarios for work. So if you think about for you as a human, you've got all these interests and what I call superpowers, the intersection of what you're good at and what you love. So up here in the magic quadrant, if you're good at it and you love doing it, that's a superpower. Like that's a skill you want to use again and again. That's the kind of problem you want to do again and again. And so the more we understand our own superpowers, there's lots of different scenarios for where we could use those superpowers. And as we develop interests and gather information, which I call know skills, as we gather those knowledges, then that defines a whole bunch of different things we could do. But there's all these different scenarios for your work. And so that where, the horse, the thing that drives the work, you need to be very, very proactive about that. Continually curious about trying to think about the next thing you want to do. And then finally, my father said, well, if you know the what and the where, even if you have a cart and a horse, you're still on your road. Like there's got to be a path. And so that's where you pick a career. You pick your next steps. There's mechanics, there's the process of either finding or creating that work. If you're in a job already, there's ways of continually sort of up leveling and developing more skills and setting, a new direction for yourself. But those are the things as individuals, the more agency we have, the more proactive we are, the more we're able to continually adjust to the next rules of work. And the less proactive and the less agency we have, the more of a fixed mindset we tend to have, and therefore the less able we are to adapt.
So I've got, I think, Gary, two more questions for you. So if you're watching live and you've got a question, now's the best chance. And by the way, you got kudos from Brazil that you answered the question.
Okay.
So the first one is, tell us, hold that book up again. Tell people when they can get it, where they can get it, and let them know that people need that.
Okay. All right. Next Rules of Work. It's actually the ebook's out now, and it'll be out in print on August 31st.
Amazon.com or wherever fine books are sold.
Yeah. I also push independent booksellers. Go to bookstore.org or
and if you're in Brazil, it's Amazon.br.
Absolutely.
If you're in Ghana, I don't know what it is. We've got folks here from Ghana and Tanzania. I don't know. Like you, wherever you can buy books, chances are you can get Gary's book here in just a few weeks.
Yeah.
So the other question I have for you is, we came here with a sort of an impossible task, right? To talk about the future of work, talk about the rules of work in the future. We've talked a little bit about this idea that the future is really always about the present, which I think in and of itself is probably worth our time for being here. But what's one thing that you wish I would have asked or that you think we still ought to talk about?
So just a couple of things. So first off, I want to encourage everybody that's listening to be thinking about, first off, your own priorities in work. And these are really challenging times. I don't want to underplay any of the difficulties that many people have had. And I also want to point out that we're talking about sort of often the kinds of work that it's a luxury if you even have a choice whether or not you're going to be doing remote work. There's tons of jobs, tons of work roles that actually require us to be in person and therefore at risk, right? And
making things, shipping things. Yeah, serving food and 100 others, right? Yep.
Yeah, and so my first charge to people is take care of yourself. Is do everything that you can to stay centered and connected, and especially connected with your coworkers and others, and to honor their lived experiences. They honor yours. I think one of the greatest insights we have from the Great Reset is that we're all whole human beings. The first time you got on a Zoom call with your coworker, you said, "Oh, you have a dog? You've got kids? You've got a sick parent?" I mean, we didn't know those things, right? So there's a whole bunch under the iceberg that we need to become more aware of. So the first takeaway is just continue to be anchored in thinking about human-centric work. If you are a manager, if you lead in an organization, it is so common for us as humans to bungee cord back to the way we used to do things. You talk about habit set. We tend to fall back into those patterns because we felt that was the way to be able to generate value. And because we're trial and error machines, we normally found that because we got all this reinforcement. Oh, that's the way to solve those problems.
Yep. But the world's different now, and so that set of habits is not necessarily going to serve us, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great insight, because habits are only so useful as they allow us to be able to continually solve the problems and have the life that we want, and they become a tax on our ability to adapt when they don't.
Absolutely. So we got a question that I think is a really interesting one, and we don't have probably time to dive in as far as it deserves, but I'd love for you to talk about it briefly. Carlos asks, how does all this change conflict with specialization? Would you say that everyone is going to become or needs to become more of a generalist?
So two quick answers, Carlos. Great question. So the first is that we are shifting in many of the shifts in the next rules of work, we're shifting from what used to be what I've often called no skills, that is deep knowledges that you gathered by a 4-year degree or other long-term learning, to much more of what I call flex skills, skills usable in a range of situations, right? So problem solving, critical thinking, collaborating. A significant amount of learning is shifting from those longer term in-depth learning experiences to what I call just-in-time and just-in-context learning. So, young person doesn't say, I'm going to go get a 4-year IT degree. They watch some YouTube videos on their digital distraction machines, and they solve the problem just in time, like the one right in front of them, and just in context. They do it as they're solving the problem. And so the opportunity is to think of it as the challenge between specialists and generalists. Think of it as a portfolio of learning. There will always be things to dive deep on to be able to develop mastery, but there will be lots of things that you can be more surfacey on. Just Google the phrase T skills, and you'll see that IBM has had this mentality for a long time. These what I call these flex skills that you can be used to be able to solve a range of problems, but also mastery in these deeper parts of the T. So
the question is, how do we not become outmoded and be able to keep up with the market? I think you've been answering that question. I didn't put it up there because the part you've been answering it. And the last question, Susan, I know Susan. Hello, Susan, who is in higher education. So she's asking a question that requires like a 3-hour session, Susan. But I think that what you just said, Gary, gets at part of this, right? We have to rethink the way we deliver and what we're trying to deliver and what's the most important parts of what we deliver. But you want to add a sentence or two to
just that? Briefly, Susan. So I wrote a long piece on medium.com called Unbundling Higher Education, which has a lot of my thoughts on this. But basically, I'm a recovering journalist, and the same way that the media business unbundled and became this much more flexible canvas of things we can gather information from, education is going to become exactly the same kind of landscape. And so to think about that, the end of adult learning and education, that's where the unbundling is already happening. It's happening right now, and it's moving its way down through the young adult launchpad of college and eventually into K-12. But I would suggest reading that piece, and you can see a lot of the trends that increasingly educators are going to need to both understand and leverage.
Gary, if you will send me the link to that on LinkedIn or something, I'll post it in wherever we're at here. We'll post that in the comments. So if you're watching this live, it'll be there in a bit. And if you're watching it later, it'll already be there. So if you'll send that to me, Gary, we'll take care of that. I've got, I just want to thank you, Gary, for being here. Hold that book up one more time. We ordered that copy, everybody.
I got to practice. Okay. Yeah, here we go.
Of work comes out in a couple of weeks. I hope you'll go ahead and get a copy. And I want to thank you, Gary, for being here. I want to tell everybody what we're up to. We're in the middle of this series called The Future of Work that we're doing right here every Friday. And whatever channel you're watching on, live or later, we're going to be back next week. And we're going to be here several weeks, bringing other experts. And then all of this is leading up to something we're doing on September the 30th. You can learn more about it at remoteleadershipinstitute.com/livecast. I don't have all of the details of exactly what it's going to look like, but what I can tell you is that we're going to go deep and start giving you solutions to some of the questions we're raising. We're going to summarize some of the things that we're talking about here, share some of the stuff that we're learning with our client in our work every single day. This live cast is free. We'll hope you go there and sign up for it today. You're not promising anything. You're locking it onto your calendar, though. remoteleadershipinstitute.com/livecast. It's going to be in a different modality than YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn, wherever you are now. You're going to love it. It's going to be highly interactive. We hope that you'll join I and other members of my team and some special guests for that. remoteleadershipinstitute.com/livecast. Again, where can people find you, Gary? Where can they reach out to you if they have comments, questions?
Yeah, please. So there's links to everything I mentioned on my website, gbolles.com. And just ping me on LinkedIn. That's, as Kevin mentioned, that's where all my courses are and a lot of my posting activities. So
gbolles.com. I think I got it right. It's right there.
Yes. Thank you, sir. That's it.
You are welcome. We got lots of people saying thank you. People saying they're going to buy their book. People have already ordered their copy.
Thank you.
And in at least 3 countries. Gary. Thanks for being here. Thanks all of you for being here. We will be back next week on Friday, noon Eastern time. And if you miss it, then it'll be here after that. Hope that you'll join us. Hope you'll join us for the live cast on September 30th, remoteleadershipinstitute.com/livecast. And with that, we'll say goodbye. We'll bid you a fair adieu. Gary, thanks so much.
Thank you, Kevin. This is marvelous.
All the best to everybody. Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Take care, folks. Be well.